Hi everybody, and welcome to Face It and Fix It. I am Joanne Haigh, and yes, I am back. I missed the last 3 shows. I was a little bit under the weather, but I'm happy to be back, and I want to welcome our viewers in Barbados and around the world. Welcome you to CBC TV 8. This is where you're watching our show now, or you are on Facebook when you typed in CBC Barbados and you're watching us there. And of course, we are also live on YouTube. Now, I want to offer some apologies for the fact that we advertised online that we would have the Honorable KIRK Humphrey, Minister of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs, and the Parliamentary Secretary, Mr. Corey Lane, to discuss elder abuse. Unfortunately, they're not able to join us, so I wish to apologize. But a number of questions came in. And we will share those questions, and we want you to still share your questions about elder abuse and what is the government doing in terms of the legislation that they are currently preparing. How do we protect our loved ones, our mothers, our fathers, our grandparents? So important. People who have worked so hard to make this country a better country, and they deserve better treatment. So I want to offer apologies for those 2 officials, the Minister and the Parliamentary Secretary. On our show today, we have Dr. Clyde Cave, Consultant Pediatrician with the QEH. He enlightens us on the recent CDC decision to vaccinate the under 5s against COVID-19. And of course, if you know Dr. Cave, we will not only be talking about that, we will cover a lot of topics pertaining to pediatrics and things that you might want to know. And what's happening in that department at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. He's not wearing the hat on a wider scale, so we want, if you're going to call or send messages, let's keep it about the kids and nothing else. We're also going to talk with Dr. Shelly-Ann Cox. Dr. Shelly-Ann Cox is an ocean professional fisheries management specialist. We all know about that Sargassum seaweed and horrible seaweed. But of course, there's a reason it's here. It's made by God. Anything made by God has a reason, and she's going to explain that. So we are certainly looking forward to those discussions. On another note, I wish to offer my condolences to the friends and family of that tragic persons who lost their lives this morning at about 3 o'clock this morning. 2 children and 2 adults, I understand, in Breezy Hill. A friend of mine, a neighbor, of the individuals, did what he could to go in, and as I heard, to save them. Unfortunately, it did not, it didn't end well, and I wish to offer my prayers to the family and friends of those loved ones. In addition to that, we are hearing from the Commissioner of Police as we continue to wrap our brains around this senseless gun crime. They spoke about this morning in terms of non-nationals coming in the country to basically what we call hitmen, guns for hire. All of these things and more are happening just right here in Barbados, and we really have to fix a lot of problems, and we do need to start with ourselves. We always ask what government can do, and rightfully so. We voted for them. They're here to help, they're here to serve. But you, me, everybody, we have a role to play in everything that happens here in this country. Are we doing enough? Are we being vigilant? I don't know. I certainly make sure that I lock up at home to make sure my daughter's protected. But a lot of these things are happening at parties, and you go on and you enjoy yourself, and then all of a sudden gunfire plays out. How do we address that? It feels as if we're just repeating ourselves over and over again, and it becomes the norm, or it seems as if it has become the norm, because every time we hear another man down, another person down, it's like, oh, okay, next, and no one reads anything into it, and no one says anything about it. We do the thoughts and prayers, and we do the rest in peace, and then we got to do it again and again and again. So how many times are we going to do the rest in peace for families that have lost their loved ones to gun violence? And I also want to send out my thoughts and prayers to Jacqueline Caesar and to Daniel Caesar on the passing of their son. Again, I too am getting tired of having to say the same thing over and over again. I'm not saying that crime won't happen. I'm not saying that people are not going to die. Everybody has to die. But how they're dying, and at the age, at 20 and 22 and 30, you're supposed to live long, live to 100, get a visit by the Governor General, not die like this. So we really have to do something, man. Let's see how we can fight this together, not just the police. Help the police. If you know something, say something and say it quietly. Now, I want to encourage you to call the show 228-5563 or 228-5562. If you want to send us a WhatsApp message, 228-5562. Now, throughout the show, we will share the messages that we received earlier to the Minister on elder abuse. Very interesting questions. So you can continue to send your questions. If you have questions for Dr. Cave, send them now, or you can call us. If you have questions for Dr. Cox, send them now, or you can call us. When we come back, we will speak with Dr. Cave after the break. Welcome back to Face It and Fix It. But before I introduce our first guest, I forgot to mention, and how could I forget, we have been on the air 1 year, 3 shows ago, but I am now back since that time. And I wanted to say to all of those behind the scenes, we've done it, we did it, and we're still here after 1 year. I want to thank Mr. Eric Eastman for preparing this mug, Face It and Fix It mug that I'm drinking some water. I'm drinking water or coffee, nothing else, Dr. Cave. And of course, it was provided by Burger King. So I want to thank Burger King too as well. One of the people who partner with CBC TV and their morning shows and radio. Thank you so much. So let's get on with the show. Good morning, Dr. Cave.
Good morning, Joyanne. Pleasure to be with you.
And a pleasure to have you as always. So before we get on to all of the other little things that everybody wants to know about their babies, we want to discuss with you about the vaccines. Vaccine advisors to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention voted unanimously last month in support of giving babies and other kids as young as 6 months the COVID-19 vaccine. The CDC director, Dr. Rochelle Walensky, signed off on the plan, clearing the way for the vaccinations to be administered from the end of June. So that's just recently, a couple of days ago. What are your thoughts on this new way now forward with the vaccines as it relates to our babies?
Well, thank you for bringing up this topic, Joyanne. It is a little confusing, even for medical professionals. And the advice that we are having from both sides of the Atlantic are a little bit different. So I think it's worthwhile to step back and look at first principles and see exactly what we're doing. The main objective, obviously, is to protect children. And we know children do get COVID, and some can be quite ill. But the majority of children who contract COVID, it will be a relatively minor disease, so they will not be severely affected. We also know that children can transmit COVID, and that if you are vaccinated, at least for a period of time, you are less likely to be able to transmit that infection. Not impossible to transmit it, but less likely. So what we're balancing is a number of probabilities. The advice coming out of the United Kingdom is perhaps a little bit more cautious. We know that American advice frequently is motivated by not just public health and individual health, but the economics of health, and that's something we have to adapt to our circumstances. So we have known over the last 2 years that the people who are most at risk of a severe outcome, which is what vaccines seek to prevent or decrease, are the very elderly and people with comorbidities. So I think at this point, it's unquestionable that every adult should be vaccinated against COVID, and people who are over, and you can pick your age at which you want to be elderly, 50, 55, 60, or with comorbidities, they should be tested and up to the minute with all the vaccines that are available. Now, when it comes to children, it's a little bit more tricky, as I said, because children tend to have very mild disease. Not unusual for a child to test positive for COVID and parents to be surprised because there were very few symptoms. Now, the uptake on vaccinating the younger children, the above 5-year-old ones, which was the next one after adults. Well, first it was adolescents, and then it was older children who were approved. I think the approval says pretty much conclusively that these vaccines are safe. So we're not really worrying about side effects for the children, which is a good thing. That's the first tenet: do no harm. The next thing is, how effective are these vaccines going to be? And it really does seem that these vaccines are more like an influenza shot, which has to be repeated periodically, as opposed to, say, something like a vaccine against chicken pox, where you get 1 or 2 shots and you're practically immune, or as best protected as we can for a long period, probably something close to life. So this is going to be a vaccine that will likely have to be administered periodically, partly because of the nature of the vaccine, and as you all know, because how frequently it's changing. Now, when you come to children, we also have an added factor where the immune system of children is not as developed as older individuals. So we're looking at how effective and how long that immune response will be to protect children from COVID. And that's where I think there is the most scientific debate. So to summarize, it does no harm. It certainly protects for a while. And if your child is a danger of becoming really ill because of some other condition, cerebral palsy, bad asthma, congenital heart disease, anything else, definitely those children should be vaccinated. In the UK, the advice is to vaccinate the child for the advantages to the child and not for the advantages to, say, the household or the community or the daycare. But we're going to have to find our own way in Barbados as to what we require. And at the moment, it is something that is optional, and parents are encouraged to talk this over with the people they trust and their medical health workers and come to their own individual decision for their children. I'm not sure if that makes it clear as people would like, Joy-Ann, but that's where we are now.
So what type of vaccine, what are we talking about? The Pfizer, the AstraZeneca?
For children, it's the Pfizer or Moderna, but we have not had Moderna available to us in large amounts. So I would imagine if it becomes available to us, or when it becomes available, it will be the Pfizer. That's what we've been using for the teenagers.
Have you seen, though, any side effects for children under 18 over 12? Because you know they can receive the Pfizer vaccine. Any major concern?
No major concerns. If you look at side effects, you have to be a little bit cautious. You know, this is a dramatic population, and a bit of a sore arm or a headache or a fever for a few hours, which are not unexpected. Any vaccination, this does happen with this, like any shot. So if you look at the numbers and then you dig down, those are the things that they are listing as side effects. Major side effects, no, none.
Because we've had one or two reports of young girls, 13, 14, period might have been a little bit off for a month or two. Is that something that's normal that could happen after a vaccine of any type?
Yes, any viral or physical illness as a stress to the body can cause menstrual irregularities, especially in younger girls, and also the emotional stress. I think one of the things that we really underestimate is how much anxiety and stress related to COVID there is in our teenage and younger population. Children, the younger children think more concretely, and the adolescents think everything in the world is directed particularly at them. So while an adult may be framing a conversation from a different perspective, adolescents think it's directly aimed at them. So if you hear there is sort of, you know, 2 or 3 in 100,000 people with a more serious complication, you talk to your teen and they're going to be convinced they're going to be in that 3. Whereas when you talk to younger children, it's free-floating anxiety that the whole world is affected, and them and their families and their day-to-day living, there is an imminent menace. So we have to be just a little bit careful of the nuance of the discussion and the perception by the particular audience, and realize younger children and teenagers can hear things differently from what adults, the media, discussions like this, what we're saying.
Okay, so I want to move away from the COVID-19 vaccine and talk about other vaccines for children. When you supposed to get this vaccine, you know there are different times, 3 months, 1 year, and you ask, do parents follow this? Is it that they can choose to have a chicken pox or not, or MMR? Is it, I think that's measles, mumps, rubella one. Do they have a choice? Or I often wondered if they had a choice, you know, to do it or not, and what happens when they enter school if they refuse to get one.
The whole world is changing, and I think part of the outcome and the overflow from this COVID vaccine discussion is people think it's a little bit like a menu from which they can select their options. There is a national schedule of immunizations for Barbados, which has been carefully determined by the Ministry of Health and Wellness, taken into context not only the diseases that affect children that age, but particularly diseases in our region, and also Barbados as a tourist destination, because we do have an influx of visitors from all over the world, and some of those destinations have other diseases that are transmissible. So the national vaccine schedule starts at 2 months, and at 2, 4, and 6 months, there are immunizations against 7 diseases: diphtheria, whooping cough, tetanus, polio, meningitis, pneumococcus, and hepatitis B. And these are fairly standard in the developed world. Now, we can't do some of the other vaccines that can pose disease, can vaccinate against some of the other diseases that can pose a problem to children, partly because the immune system is mature and the vaccines don't work. We have learned that it's not just about wanting to do something, we have to find the right vaccine and the right host, the individual who receives that vaccine and is able to mount an immune response. And younger children with immune systems that are immature, there has to be a period of trial, which is why it took longer to determine not just safety, but the efficacy of vaccines in this young population. So in the first year, babies get shots at 2, 4, and 6 months. Now, parents do have care and custody of their children and make decisions for these children, but there is also someone who has to look out for the population. A child, for example, who gets, say, diphtheria, it's not only that child who's at risk, it's all the other children that could be in contact with. And in our society, with daycare and children being mixed together, this is a public health concern as well. So a lot of the daycare nurseries will require that your child be fully immunized. Certainly all the government nurseries have to, and I think most of the responsible private ones also request that this be done where the child is accepted. When you get to 1 year of age, there's a second round of immunizations, like you mentioned, measles, mumps, and rubella, and chickenpox. Both of those highly effective vaccines that prevent against very contagious diseases that we know spread with travel. They've had outbreaks of measles and mumps in the continental USA, prior to COVID. It's still going on there at a lower rate. Measles is a highly transmissible infection. So if it were to be brought into Barbados and we did not have the protection of the majority of our children being vaccinated, then this would be a major health problem. I think people forget that these diseases can cause significant illness, and actually children can die from things, even though we think of it as diseases of the past. But we have to remind ourselves it's only a disease of the past because we have vaccinated our children. When we change that and vaccinate less, we will see more disease.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you about the allegations, I should say, over the years about linking vaccines to things like autism. And I also want to know what kind of illnesses we are seeing right now at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital's pediatric department, because not everything that you sniffle on now these days is COVID. There are other things out there. When we come back after the break. Welcome back to Face It and Fix It. We are speaking with Dr. Clyde Cave, consultant pediatrician at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And before the break, we asked you, Dr. Cave, about the vaccines and the link, or the alleged link, I should say, to autism. Over the years, we've been hearing stories. Is there any truth to this? Have they ever linked any behavioral disorders to vaccines over the years?
Of modern vaccines, no, and that's where the problem has been, because there was an erroneous paper which has been proved to be completely false and deliberately altered to give the impression of an effect between the MMR and autism. This has been completely disproved, both scientifically, where there's been a retraction of the paper and a disbarment of the author, as well as real life experience. So there is no link between autism and vaccines. The problem is that it's easier to prove when there is not a link than sometimes it is to prove the cause. And we don't fully understand autism, and we don't really know what the cause is. It may not be a single cause, it may be a variety of causes that have to come together to create this spectrum of behaviors that we describe and label as autism. The numbers have been going up in the developed world, in North America. They've, over the last 2 decades, a noticeable increase, thought to not just be limited to increased diagnosis, but to be a real effect of increase in rates of autism. And we are seeing that reflected here too in Barbados, where we are diagnosing more children who are affected and on what we describe as the autism spectrum. Because autism can be from relatively mild to quite severe and incapacitating. And most children who have concerns about autism are picked up in the second year of life after the first birthday, because frequently the thing that's noticed most is a delay or some change in speech and speech patterns. So for parents and health workers who screen children, there are some subtle signs in emotional response and behaviors that can be detected quite early, but it is often the speech. The delay in speech, the not using of words, solitary play, some unusual behaviors and meltdowns, which alert people that this is a vulnerable child who needs to be assessed for autism.
Okay, so again, now, before the break, I'd asked you about some of these viruses that we see in everybody. Certainly myself, I remember having to cough the other day, and I was in my mask, and I rushed outside of the store, and I was kind of ducking because I thought someone was just about to attack me for coughing, because everybody seems to associate now a cough, a sneeze with COVID. And I know you know this, because a couple of weeks ago, I rely on Dr. K for basically everything. You know, my he's a pediatrician, he has a lot of knowledge. And I said to him, because I was battling a cough, and so was my daughter. And we got tested, and it wasn't COVID. And I called him, and I'm like, well, it's not COVID. He said, well, there are other things. So I want you to elaborate on the other things that you are now seeing at the QEH as it relates to the children coming in, and what other viruses are out there that we're seeing outside of COVID?
Well, let's just say that a lot of these viruses would not come to the hospital because only very ill children would show up in accident and emergency. We're seeing these kinds of things more in polyclinic and private office settings, which is what I can speak to now, because my term at the hospital has ended. When you reach a certain age, you retire, which has its good and its challenging aspects. But my work at the hospital was usually largely with newborn babies. So, the feeling you get from what's going around in the community is probably more from your practice, or for those doctors who work in the primary care or polyclinic setting. And during COVID, it was really quite easy that with the severe restrictions and protocols, there were no viruses hardly going around besides COVID. So if there was a cough or a sneeze, chances are it was more likely to be that. And because a lot of children were at home, you would kind of know if the virus was in the household from the symptoms of other people. as we have opened back up and children have gone back into settings like daycare and nursery, has been really dramatic, where the other viruses have reappeared. I think in 2021, it was wonderful where in the office you hardly saw any sick children with respiratory symptoms. Now we are back to guessing. This fever and runny nose can be a number of things. Now, if there's no fever and it's just a runny nose and a cough, it's not just an infection we have to consider. There's that big Sahara dust cloud that was making a lot of people ill and coughing and sneezing. And the dust got into masks, and whenever you put on your mask, you could cough or sneeze, which would lead people to react in the way they did to you. Every sneeze while you're shopping is a major event. So we're now having to distinguish patterns of viral infections in children. And to be honest, it is not possible to determine which virus causes which symptoms without doing tests. So frequently, if you're suspicious enough, you do a test and it comes back negative, and once that was the appropriate test, done in the appropriate way at the appropriate time, all of which are variables, and we know it's not COVID, then you identify other things. And there has been an influenza type B virus that has apparently been circulating in our community. There are in children a few signs that say it's more likely to be that. One is that the fever tends to be higher than children who have COVID. Children who have COVID tend not to have high fevers, although they can. And the cough from this influenza virus, it's a thicker mucus, and the cough is more in the head rather than the drier, chesty, lower cough that you get from COVID. But you cannot depend on these signs to conclusively say it's one virus or the other. The other thing that we're seeing, I think as part of the influenza virus, but it may be a separate stomach virus, there have been cases of vomiting and diarrhea making the rounds. I think that's associated with the influenza virus, but there seems to be a break. You either get the thick mucus and heavy head cold, then you get a little bit better and you get the stomach upset and diarrhea, or the other way around. Vomiting, a little bit of fever, and a soft stool for a day or two, you think they're better, and then this thick mucus comes on. So I think those are the things that are circulating. We have had some concerns related to people traveling and getting chicken pox. That's always a concern for us as a tourist environment. The more people who come and travel, the more likely they are to bring chicken pox. And unless our children are protected against it, we're likely to see an outbreak from that or the other infectious diseases like measles and rubella.
So when you get vaccinated, I remember growing up having mumps. And I think I said this before. And Mom, I know you're home. I know you're not well, but I hope you're listening. I'm not sure if that meant that she did not get me vaccinated 52 years ago. I don't know if it was around, but I remember having mumps. Do we still see mumps even though you're vaccinated? You don't see that?
Any vaccine does have a small amount of people who, for one reason or another, did not take the immunization, if you look at it that way. But it's extremely rare if you have a high population, high percentage of children in your population who are vaccinated. That's the so-called herd immunity, which we heard a lot of discussion. If many people are vaccinated, it stops the transmission going from one person to another to another. But the first vaccine against MMR is at 1 year, which means that children under a year are susceptible. So we have to depend on other people not bringing measles or mumps to them. For the first few months of life, the child has the mother's, some degree of the mother's immunity. So the mother's immunity can, for the first couple of months, protect a child, providing she is immunized. But then we do have that vulnerable group in the latter half of the first year where they are really susceptible and depend on other older children and adults being vaccinated to protect them. So yes, it's not a disease of the past. It's not been eradicated. And certainly 3 years ago, before the COVID restrictions, there were really concerning outbreaks of measles and mumps. And yes, I know that has again become a public health concern with increased travel and selected populations in other countries who are choosing not to immunize. And it will only be a matter of time before these illnesses reemerge in children there.
Okay, well, I'm going to take a quick break because the next question I have here is pertaining to pediatric cancer, and I think that the response might be a little bit long. So we're going to take a break. When we come back, more with Dr. Cave and your questions when we come back. Welcome back to Face It and Fix It. We're speaking with Dr. Clyde Cave, consultant pediatrician QEH, but we're not speaking about QEH. We're speaking about pediatric matters outside of the hospital, what you see in the private doctors or even polyclinics in general. A question came to us, and I believe they might put it on the screen. If not, I'll just read it. Basically, I'll just kind of paraphrase it. Basically, they want to know if a child can be born with cancer. But the question is, can you born with cancer? That's what they're asking.
Yes, you can, but it is extremely, extremely rare. So let's talk a little bit about what cancer is. Cancer is a cell or a group of cells that kind of go rogue. They're not subjected to the usual constraints of growth or destruction of abnormal cells. Body is marvelous surveillance system, the immune system that is constantly on patrol, and it detects abnormal cells that can become cancerous and it gets rid of them. Now, if there is a problem with the immune system, then those cells can go out of control and you have growths and cancers. And it is very rare that children are born with cancerous growths or develop them at a very young age, which means that that cancerous growth would have been there for a little while. Now, people do wonder whether your susceptibility to cancer is something that you have inherited. There are families we know where certain cancers are more prevalent, and this may be because the immune system, which is on surveillance for those cancers, has a gap in it somewhere that it doesn't detect these cancers, which allows them to grow. So the short answer is yes, you can be born with cancers. There are some cancers that are more common in childhood, whether they develop before you were born or soon after you were born. We're thinking about tumors like tumors of the kidney or the nervous system close around the kidneys, leukemias, and brain cancers. Those are the common kinds of cancers that you see in children, but there are also rare cancers that can occur from anywhere, from bone tissue or from cartilage tissue. So yes, anything that is unusual in a child would be checked out. Cancer would be a possibility, but unlikely. But the older you get, the more likely abnormal things could turn out to be a manifestation of a malignancy.
Well, a follow-up question to that being asked is, what about asthma? Can you actually born with asthma?
Again, so asthma is not related to cancer at all. We should first make that clear in case anybody gets a connection, because we're talking about them so close together. Now, you are probably not born with asthma as in an asthma attack, but you may be
Can you
born
explain, sorry, Dr. Cave, because sorry, the question actually came up. What is asthma? Sorry, they asked. And can you be born with asthma? Sorry, go ahead.
Right. So asthma, as we know it, is an asthma attack where there is difficulty in breathing. And that difficulty in breathing is because the small airway passages are narrow. And they get narrow because suddenly the muscles around those go into spasm. So you get an airway that goes smaller because those muscles go into spasm. But also the inside of the airway inside here can get narrower because there is swelling, which is why an allergy which causes swelling of the lining can cause difficulty in breathing because those airways are narrower. Also, once you get that kind of inflammation or irritation, then the muscles go into spasm. So there are three factors which create an asthma attack. Increased mucus production, which helps to narrow the airways. Edema or swelling of the lining of the airways, which is the inflammatory response, and the spasm of the smooth muscle, which causes a constriction. Important to know these aspects because those are the things we treat. If asthma comes on suddenly, it's most likely because the muscles have been irritated and gone into spasm, and you use a muscle reliever, an asthma reliever that's a muscle relaxant, something like a Ventolin. If it's been going on for a little bit longer and it's because of irritation and it's swelling of the linings and that inflammatory response needs to be controlled, that's where your inhaled steroids or preventers come into play. And the mucus, well, you don't want the mucus to be thick, so you may add a medicine to keep the mucus thin and runny so that it doesn't stay down in the chest and confuse it all the more. Now, the feeling is that you may be born with an allergic tendency. We know that that happens. And people who have atopy or susceptibility to allergies also have a susceptibility to reactive airways, which would lead to asthma. There's also a feeling that if in childhood you get an infection in the lungs that can damage your lining or your muscles, then those airways get to be twitchy or reactive, and then they can be, when stimulated, result in an asthma attack. So yes, you're probably born with a predisposition to asthma, but about 25% of people who have asthma, we think it's a reaction to something that happened in childhood. So people who get frequent respiratory diseases in childhood, the feeling is they may end up being more susceptible to acquiring asthma. So once you have those overreactive airways, then it can develop into what we know as an asthma attack under the right conditions.
So Bajans will tell you that the child born with asthma, but the growth of it, is that true? Is that possible?
Sort of. They probably don't grow out of the lungs reacting, but as the lungs get bigger, a small amount of narrowing of the airways is probably not going to result in appreciable symptoms, whereas in a younger it would cause difficulty in the air moving in and out of the lungs. People who think they have grown out of asthma, it's possible in the lab under certain conditions and certain triggers to show that their tests change and they are exchanging their air less efficiently. So it is possible under the right circumstances for them to get an asthma attack, but the asthma attacks are usually to a lesser degree, so they think they have grown out of it.
And what about something called hay fever? Is that similar to asthma? Because the treatment for hay fever, you do get nebulized as well?
Hay fever can be very similar. What we call hay fever is an allergic reaction, so this would be similar to allergic asthma, but the place that's reacting is the lining of the nose and the upper airways, whereas asthma, it's the lower airways and down in the lungs. Atopy is a condition where people's immune systems are overactive, so they are prone to responding to allergens, which are things that incite allergy. And when that happens, then wherever is affected, that's where you get the symptoms. So sometimes with Sahara dust, if you have ocular allergies, you will see that the eyes, outside of the eyes, gets inflamed and they get red and watery and itchy. And if you look on the inside of the eyelids, you will see that it's swollen. Red, swollen, itchy, increased discharge. Now, if that happens because the allergen is pollen or dust or an irritant that gets into your nasal passages, then the symptoms will be a runny nose and sneezing. If the part of you that's responding is the back of your throat and your voice box, then you may get hoarseness and a cough. If it's asthma and the part that's reacting is down in your lungs, then you get wheezing or difficulty on breathing out and increased mucus and an asthmatic cough. Now, atopic people also get things that we may not automatically think of as being related, and one of those is in the skin. People who have a tendency to hay fever and sinusitis and asthma are also prone to atopic eczema, and they're also prone to migraine headaches. So whatever the trigger, sometimes if it's the blood vessels on the surface of the brain reacting, you get the headache. If it's in the lungs, you get the asthma. If it's in the nose, you get the hay fever. If it's in the eyes, you get the allergic conjunctivitis. If it's the whole immune system, it may manifest itself in the skin with a flare-up of eczema.
Okay, well, I want to ask about the fix now for some of these allergies and asthma, and let's talk medication. There are people who just go and use regular bush. When I say regular bush, my daughter's caregiver, Kathy at home, believes in bush, Wonderworld and Cersei Bush and everything. And people will tell you that sometimes that works. Some people put garlic and put it in a little orange juice and draw that. But then you have things that sell called kyolic garlic extraction. So maybe there's some truth into that. But that's the natural stuff. The actual medicine now, and I know I discussed this with you, where people are using Histil, but they're also using bisulfite. So they want to thin the mucus with the bisulfite, but still using a cough suppressant, which doesn't make sense. I want you to explain that again for a lot of parents out there who are actually doing this. I'm telling you for sure, a lot of parents are doing this.
Well, as a community, I think we like medicines. We've been taught that, a medicine for every symptom. And there are some doctors who prescribe that, but it's really not viewed as efficient or elegant management of disease to give multiple medicines for multiple symptoms, because medication can cross-react. So going back to first principles, we want to treat the symptoms. So if your nose is runny, okay, that may be an irritant and something you want to stop. So you would use a medicine that stops the runny nose. And that's where the antihistamines, of which Histil is a brand, but there are others. So the antihistamines will stop a runny nose. Now, the question is, do you really want to stop the runny nose? Because when you stop the runny nose, you stop it by making that mucus thicker. And thick mucus is harder to cough up, especially in younger children who don't know how to blow their nose and get rid of it. So it may be less on the outside, but then the symptoms get worse because the mucus is thicker and blocking up nostrils. And if it's down in the lungs, you certainly don't want that to do. Now, as an infection progresses, the mucus tends to get thicker, especially if there's an early bacterial secondary infection. So at that time, you'd want to get the mucus out and you'd want it to be thin. You coughed, it came up, didn't stay down in the chest. And that's when you would use a mucolytic, which is something that thins out mucus, which is Bisolven is one of the brands, but there are others. So some parents will want to stop the runny nose and do something for the cough. So they're using something to thicken the mucus at the same time as they're using something to thin the mucus. And unfortunately, these medications don't target different parts of the body in different ways. So you're really working in opposition, and it doesn't make much therapeutic sense. There's also the concern with overuse of antihistamines in younger children. The American Academy of Pediatric recommend use of antihistamines as a general treatment for upper respiratory allergies or viral infections in under 5 or 6 year olds because the advantage is not great. It's just symptomatic control, and there can be overdose concerns. There is pressure on a parent to stop the runny nose so that they can go into daycare. But even though you don't have the runny nose, you can still pass on the virus. So that's probably not a great idea. And it's always been said, if you treat a cold with any of these remedies, it's going to be gone in 7 days. And if you don't treat a cold and just let it run its course, it's going to be gone in a week. So it doesn't really make much difference. Going back to your bush tea remedies, a lot of those substances can have effects on the body. We know some of them are mild irritants, especially the inhalants, and those will actually cause the mucus to thin out and run so you can get it up. So, there are possible ways in which these old remedies can have a positive therapeutic effect, as long as you know what you're doing and you're not overdoing it.
So menthol crystals and some hot water is okay with a cloth over your head to inhale the steam. That's safe.
Yes, the thing with that you worry about, Joyanne, is children moving around, parents being distracted, using hot water and burns. Mm-hmm. There can be spills and scalds. And remember, menthol is a mild irritant, so it can cause the eyes to get red and runny. It will also slightly irritate the nasal lining, which is what you're trying to do. That will cause the mucus to run and sort of flush out the system, as it were. So you will have some resulting increase in comfort as you clear a lot of that mucus out of the head. So yes, it has its place.
So advisable parents to do not leave your children unattended with hot water, and perhaps maybe put some things over their eyes, those little sleep guards over your eyes, and wait with your child and not just put it on and ask your children to shout you back when you're finished. One of the other things too that we take for granted is our beautiful ocean, the beach. Tell us a little bit about having a seawater bath in children and as it relates to these allergies. How helpful is it?
Very helpful. It just flushes everything out. If an allergen, you imagine a little grain of pollen or a bit of dust that's irritating the nasal mucosa, it gets there, it starts to irritate, it's producing more mucus. If you went to the sea and washed it out, it wouldn't be there and the irritation would be less. Also, salt water is healing, it decreases swelling. In babies who might be a little bit inconvenient to get to the beach, we often recommend saline drops to the nostrils to help them clear what mucus is there because they can't sneeze. It's easier and more fun to go to the beach. Not recommended if the child has a fever, because then you'd want to keep the body temperature more stable. But certainly for allergies, in the recovery part of an upper respiratory virus, a good saltwater washout at the beach really helps you get rid of what's there, and decreases the amount of stuff that the body is going to be producing that night and the next day. You know, we all know your nose will run at the beach, and you will sleep better that night.
So when you tell patients, mothers, fathers, make sure that they drink lots of liquids, does that necessarily mean water, or you just want them to drink liquids? Could that be soup? Could that be tea? Or would you more recommend water as a way to use when you have thick mucus and these colds?
Well, Joanne, you know, with children, you take whatever they will give you. So whatever they will drink is fine. Preferably not milk, because there seems to be an association with milk and mucus, increasing the mucus, but anything else is fine. You do have to worry a little bit about the sugar load that you're giving a child who may not be feeling well. You load them up in fluids which are high in sugar, and then you have this sugar high child bouncing around who is not feeling well. Not going to be a pleasant situation. But yes, if the child likes soup, if they like water, if they like whatever healthy drink that you can get into them, I would even go so far as to say, if they're not feeling well and they really will take fluids, dilute the juices, but don't focus right then on the sugar content. A little bit of sugar in a child who's not eating will probably be a source of energy, and if it helps them consume it, it's better for them to have some sugar in what they're drinking than not drinking anything at all because they don't like how it tastes.
A quick question here. Hi, Joanne. Can you ask Dr. Cave, how do you fix diarrhea in children? Do you let it run its course?
Yes, that's an important one to think about, because all diarrhea is not the same. If it's an acute diarrhea that is likely to be self-limiting, and that will be because of a viral infection or possibly eating something bad, like a version of food poisoning, and that's going to run its course over a few days. You want to keep up with it, and there's a school of thought that says you don't really want to slow it down, keep the infection in the body and allow it to spread and cause more problems. So yes, in an adult, because of convenience, you may use medications that slow down the diarrhea, but that just means you keep it inside your body and empty your bowels at a more convenient time. Not recommended in children, keeping the virus, or if it's a bacterial cause, particularly inside the body. Now, a diarrhea is more concerning if there's certain things associated with it, like blood in the stool or mucus, or pain. If this is happening, then that's a case where it should be checked out. The other thing we worry about is the consequences of prolonged diarrhea, where the child will be losing fluid but also electrolytes. And this is particularly worrying if there's vomiting as well, because you're not able to replenish the losses in stool because there's vomiting. So vomiting and diarrhea is a much higher risk of dehydration and complications and needs to be looked at. But in most cases of mild diarrhea, like what we know is going around now, the vomiting at the beginning once or twice and then it stops. Then there's a slight pause of hours or a day. Then there's loose stool 3 or 4 times a day, but the child is still drinking. As long as they are active and not dehydrated, then this is when you allow the virus to run its course. And one of the best ways of telling if a child is dehydrated is how much urine it's producing. The child should be producing a good amount of urine 3 or 4 times a day. If it's less than that, the body needs water. You know, after the urine production goes down, you start to see lack of tears, the inside of the mouth being dry, the skin changing its texture. But you know, one of the earliest signs to look out for is this child peeing the normal color, not concentrated, the normal amount 3 or 4 times in a 24-hour period? Then we can feel much more confident that this child is not severely dehydrated, which is the main complication of diarrhea while we allow it to run its course.
Okay, we got 2 more questions that came coming in before we wrap up. Honey, is it true that children, babies, should not use honey?
One would have to say yes, because there is a rare condition that has been associated in some parts of the world with some honeys at some time, causing a severe infection. You know, so one episode or potential has resulted in this overwhelming ban on honey in children. I guess there is not a lot of need for sweeteners in children, so it's not that honey would be an essential food group. And if there's a potential for even a rare infection, I guess it's best to avoid it.
Okay, and the next one person asked here, you mentioned about bringing up mucus, that's important. My child coughs, brings it up, but swallows it back. Where does that mucus go?
It would produce a very smelly stool for you.
Okay.
You know, once it's not in the lungs,
It doesn't go back into
if
the
they
lungs
will,
once they swallow it. That's, I guess, what that's swallowing it doesn't put it back into the lungs.
no, no.
Okay.
If it's a weak cough, it may just be sort of rattling around in the lungs and not coughed out of the lungs. But once there's a strong cough and it comes into the mouth, then it either comes out the mouth or gets swallowed into the stomach, where it's partly digested and comes through. It will make the stool softer. It may make the stool green, and it usually makes the stool smelly, and it may change the texture, and you see streaks of mucus. So if a child is swallowing a lot of its mucus, that's fine. It's not in the lungs, which is our main objective. It probably means you do have to change smelly diapers.
Okay. Well, my response to the textures I understand, but the smell, I believe I wouldn't know how to differentiate between what is and is not when it comes to a smelly stool. Because babies, people have always often asked, why is it that a baby, when they have to stool, it's actually worse than adults? What's in it? And maybe perhaps you could answer that question. And partly it seems to be more offensive to the nostrils than adult. What happens there?
Well, a stool is not only what you eat and it remains from your digestion, it's what has been produced with the bacteria that are normally in the bowel. So there's kind of a fermentation process going on, which is why sometimes that can produce gas. There are different bacteria and there are different food substrates, and some substrates produce a different smell and consistency. And mucus is one that's thought to produce a different consistency. Sugars are one that tend to be fermented and metabolized, and fatty foods are the ones that we think give more of the bad smell. But obviously all these things are going on together in various proportions, so that's why the specific blend of aroma can vary from person to person, certainly from child to child. And parents will tell you, or most people believe, that a exclusively breastfed baby will have a different smelling stool to one that is formula fed. People have used the words more pleasant smelling stool, but I guess that would be an individual judgment.
Yeah, very strange one too at that. But another question, my children are gluten intolerant. They're very young, 3, 5, and 7 years old. Were they born this way? That's what they're asking. Is that, I don't know if you, I'm not saying you would know, but I guess they're probably wondering whether or not children are born gluten intolerant.
If this is real, and gluten intolerance has become quite fashionable in recent times. So you would wonder if all the things that are ascribed to gluten insensitivity or intolerance are real, if this is, a confirmed diagnosis or just something that the neighbor has, so I think my child has it too. But real gluten intolerance, if all three children affected, this is probably something that is a family trait, rather than just an individual condition. So because of the impact of gluten sensitivity on the kind of food you have to eat, possible consequences, the cost of gluten-free foods, it's well worth making sure that this is a definite medically confirmed diagnosis so that you can take the appropriate steps. But if there's several children with this condition in the family, the chances are that genetic, metabolic, and familial, not something that is just bad luck that one child may have acquired.
And my last question to you, now that we're still in a COVID environment, but we're not where we were in 2020 and 2021, have you seen a sense of normalcy as it relates to your pediatric patients coming in, mothers feeling a little bit more relaxed, or is everything still kind of leaning towards a COVID panic in your practice?
I think there is a change, and I think there is less panic. I think on one side there is a desire to be over it, so we're behaving as though we're over it, and inevitably there will be a rude awakening of somebody getting COVID in households that don't take care. Unfortunately, even if you are responsible, take care, restrict your exposure, wear masks, have open air contact, there is still the possibility of getting COVID. Now, I think we have realized when it comes to children that most children do not get severely ill. So I think when a family has been through it and had children with positive COVID tests and they realize that they were not ill for long, in fact, some of them have like a fever for a matter of hours and hardly a runny nose and not a cough, whereas there are other members in the family who are suffering for much longer and to a greater degree. They realize that it's really not such a bad thing in children. Unfortunately, that is most children, not all children. So we can't really say safely, let it rip, the child is going to get COVID, but it's only going to be mild. Nobody can say it's only going to be mild. We also know that there are special children with other conditions. We've talked about asthma and childhood cancers and other things this morning, and they have to be specially protected. And we also have to remember that those children are part of a household and they may be susceptible to parents or grandparents, uncles, aunties, who, if they contract COVID from a child, that would be extremely unfortunate if they had severe illness. So you vaccinate all those who can be vaccinated, which is the adults for sure, and the teenagers most likely. You really do all the intelligent, responsible things to prevent overexposure or overspread of this virus, which we know is a respiratory virus and spread by respiratory droplets, close contact, confined spaces. We know the things that we can do to minimize, not eradicate, but minimize the likelihood of contracting COVID, which in children in most cases will be mild, but there is a possibility of those children who can be severely affected from COVID.
Wow. Well, Dr. Cave, I want to thank you so much. And before I let you go, I must tell our viewers that I have known Dr. Cave Mistral. My daughter, Missy, will be 32 tomorrow, funny enough. And I've known Dr. Cave for that long, and he has not aged. He has no hair now, but he has not aged. And I would like to do a special show with Dr. Cave to find out how do we stop the aging process, because clearly he has found the secret. But I want to thank you because you really have not changed physically, minus the fact that you might be follically challenged at the moment, which might be by choice because you decided to take all of the hair off. It's a pleasure. It was a pleasure having you here. And I know you're no longer at the QEH in that capacity, but you did a damn good job. And I just wanted you to know that whatever you continue to do, because I believe you're going to continue with your pediatric practice, and you're also a consultant, and you've always done what you do to the best of your ability. And everybody, all of our children are so much better off having passed through you. I want to thank you publicly. I'm thanking you for your service too publicly at the QEH hospital when you wore that hat as the Director of Medical Services. Final words?
Thank you, Joy-Ann. Yes, we'll stick with being follically challenged as a choice. Please wish Missy happy birthday for me tomorrow. She was one of my first patients. I've been back for 33 years in private practice. And yes, thank you for your kind words. It was an honor to serve during the time of crisis when the country needed all hands on deck to fight COVID.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Cave. Thank you.
Thank you.
When we come back, Dr. Cox, and we're going to talk sargassum seaweed after the break. Welcome back to Face It and Fix It. Our next guest is Dr. SHELLY-ANN Cox. She is an experienced ocean professional and fisheries management specialist. She holds an interdisciplinary PhD in natural resources management from the UWI Cayfield campus and a Bachelor of Science honors in environmental and natural resource management with marine biology from the UWI St. Augustine's campus. I want to welcome SHELLY-ANN, Dr. SHELLY-ANN Cox, to the program. And let me also mention she has 10 years experience in applied interdisciplinary climate-related research and fisheries management research. Sounds like you spent most of your life studying. And you look so young.
Yes. Yes, and underwater, which is a good thing.
And underwater.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Well, you know, Barbadians and beachgoers a little annoyed when every time they go to the beach and they see all of this sargassum seaweed, or tourists, they can't go into the water. It has a smell. It's not attractive. Tell us exactly what is sargassum seaweed?
Well, sargassum seaweed is a brown seaweed, and many of you might not realize, but there are two different species that we're seeing, Sargassum natans and Sargassum fluitans. They are even different types between them, but we won't get too technical this morning. But this sargassum that we see, we refer to it as pelagic sargassum. It floats on the top of the water. And if you look closely, you see these little air-filled sacs that cause them to be buoyant. Sargassum, we view it as a hazard, but recently we have been discussing how to turn it into opportunity. And, later in our conversation, we can talk about the multiplicity of uses of sargassum, lots of innovation around products and services for sargassum cleanup, for example, seeing very innovative things like aqua drones and products, high value extracts that are even being used for antiviral agents. So quite interesting that, some people first thought that the sargassum that we're seeing now came from the Sargasso Sea, which is in the North Atlantic. But really the source of the sargassum that we're seeing on our shores right now is in the tropical Atlantic. This, from the Gulf of Guinea, that's Africa, to the north coast of Brazil. In this area that we refer to as a consolidation area, and scientists have referred to it as North Equatorial Recirculation Region. So that region, is being fed by the Amazon as well as the Congo River. So there are several factors that have led to the proliferation of the sargassum influxes that we're seeing. Not only the increasing sea surface temperatures, but nutrients, upwelling, for instance. Sahara dust has been attributed to sargassum, the proliferation of sargassum. And, scientists are still doing research to find out what exactly is causing the influxes. Of course, the changing currents are bringing the sargassum here to the Caribbean. And as far as Mexico, the latest Sargassum Outlook Bulletin that was released by Dr. Hugh and his team from the University of South Florida just highlighted that June just broke the historical record in terms of sargassum, the estimated sargassum biomass in the tropical Atlantic. They recorded 24.2 million metric tons. So quite substantial.
Wow.
2018 was the worst year to date. But yes, in terms of our colleagues that are using satellite imagery, they would have detected 24.2 million metric tons in the tropical Atlantic. And this is not all that's coming to the beach. So just imagine the amount of sargassum
is inside the ocean.
But
let me ask you this, Dr. Cox. Let me ask you this quick question, because this is not the only type of seaweed in the ocean. But it's almost like if something, people may be a little superstitious, and why this particular type? I mean, we've seen grow up with green seaweed or other plant life, other things on the seabed. Why this one? Are they still trying to figure out why this one rises and comes to shore? Is that still?
Well, this one, yeah, there are other sargassum species that you said are on the seabed that attach themselves to the seabed, as well as, well, you would know growing up, we refer to different types of moss. But this one always, its full life cycle has always been pelagic in terms of floating on top of the water. You know, sargassum at sea isn't very bad. It's actually good because it's a nursery. You would see a lot of small fish, mahi-mahi, dolphin as we call it, even flying fish, they spawn on sargassum. So it's a really good habitat at sea. It's really when it comes in contact with fishing gear, even boats that are navigating, then it starts to become an issue. So the Sargasso Sea, you know, has been seen as, you know, a very important habitat. There are, you know, lots of policies in place to make sure that it's conserved. But this area in the tropical Atlantic, you know, is a symptom of climate change. And it's really beyond what we can do in terms of mitigating the impacts. Even with exploring the uses, we are still not using the amount of quantities of sargassum that could really make a difference.
So when you said it's one of the symptoms of climate change, is going to be my next question, and if it has anything to do with it. Is this because of the rising sea temperatures, as you said, brings it up? So basically, human beings are contributing to, as we all know. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so rising sea surface temperatures, as you outlined, as well as nutrients. So we would know with our, you know, fertilizers, pesticides, even forest, you know, cutting down forests and so on. And all of that's going into the rivers, that's going out into the Amazon and Congo as well from the African side. You know, a lot of other pollutants. And it's quite interesting too that the sargassum, you know, kind of soaks up all of these pollutants. And the sargassum that beaches, when we're able to test it, we're finding very high levels of heavy metals like arsenic and cadmium. So it really goes to show that, you know, our actions, and when we're irresponsible with our actions, it could lead to a hazard and a phenomenon such as sargassum influxes. You know, and of course, we're seeing some changes in currents as well too. I mean, this is still being studied, but you know, that change in currents are now bringing these sargassum influxes to the Caribbean and straight to the Gulf of Mexico. I've seen some places like Panama, for instance, reporting sargassum influxes this year. Mexico never really saw sargassum influxes as early as January. So 2020 is breaking a lot of records as it relates to sargassum influxes. We've always believed that, you know, it's something that's going to stay. Although in the past there would be, you know, very years where there's significant influxes, and then 2 or 3 years there will be some break. But yeah, since 2018, you know, from year to year, it has been quite significant.
When was the first influx, you would say, in Barbados? You have that on record?
Yes, 2011. So it's just about a decade since we've been seeing sargassum influxes. And of course, when it first occurred, we would have been familiar with what sargassum is, because even when you speak to older fishermen, they would tell you that they refer to it as ocean moss. And this would be the type of moss that would be coming from the Sargasso Sea. But from 2011, this is when we started to see a new source, and, you know, in large quantities. You know, persons describe mats out to sea as larger than, you know, football fields, quite significant. And then, you know, 2018, for instance, you know, I am almost 6 feet myself, and there was sargassum stacked up on the East Coast about that high. So we're talking, you know, lots of biomass, and, you know, certain health implications as well, because when the sargassum does decompose, it releases hydrogen sulfide and ammonia gases. And, just before you were speaking to respiratory illnesses, and we've gotten a few reports of persons suffering respiratory illnesses as a result of, those persons living close to areas where sargassum decomposes. And in Martinique and Guadeloupe, I believe they really have invested a bit more in the health research. For instance, they would have invested in some instrumentation to actually measure the levels of hydrogen sulfide and ammonia gases. And they've been reporting the hospitalizations as well in some of the reports that we're seeing coming out of Martinique and Guadeloupe. And quite recently, they published a paper. They worked with over 3,000 pregnant women. And what they found, that exposure to sargassum actually might contribute to early onset of preeclampsia. So this is quite scary. We know the impacts it has on tourism, how it looks on the beach, but the health implications are quite scary, especially if it can contribute to the early onset of preeclampsia.
But let me ask you this: when you say these gases are coming off of, this is when it's coming onto the beach, or if it's left there for a period of time? Because when it's left there for a period of time. So once it beaches and there's water, it keeps moist, then it starts to break down, and that's the smell. The overpowering scent that you would get, especially if you go to River Bay, for example. That is the hydrogen sulfide gas. I've also smelt it in St. Lucia in a place called Praslin. You can smell it before you see the influx on the beach. So these are the gases that are contributing to respiratory illnesses. Persons have, complained of their chest feeling tight, for instance. And, some persons who actually dive in the sargassum have gotten some irritation on the skin as well. Okay, I think we have to take a quick break, but when we come back now, we're going to talk about removing the sargassum and then the benefits of the sargassum seaweed when we come back after the break. Welcome back to Face It and Fix It. We're speaking with Dr. Shelly-Ann Cox. We talk about several problems on this show, but one of the major issues, and every Barbadian has been talking about every time they see it, especially beach goers and people who live near the ocean, is sargassum seaweed. And Dr. Shelly-Ann Cox is here to explain, as she has so far, what is it, where is it coming from. I forgot to ask you before we move on to the question I said I was going to ask. When you said it's on the River Bay, because I know some happened down Long Bay side, this is the south. So was the west impacted as well, like right around Barbados?
The west is actually spared from sargassum influxes. We did
Gold
have
Coast was spared.
We did have an influx, I believe, 2 years ago, close to Gibbs Beach. But usually it's the windward side of the island that's significantly impacted. You would see some, sargassum in Carlisle Bay, but never in a significant amount.
Okay. So let's talk about the cleanup. In the ocean
Yes.
itself and on the beach. So let me start with in the ocean. Do we do a cleanup as it's settling and it's thick on the ocean floating, or do we wait until it comes to shore on the sand?
Well, ideally, we would want to clean up the sargassum before it arrives. But these operations are quite expensive. There are some boats that are retrofitted to harvest the sargassum at sea, and it's usually used with a boom. I don't know if you would have seen the booms at Crane Beach, for example. It's like a barrier, right? So, in terms of at sea cleanup, I would say Dominican Republic and Mexico have been using our barriers, to stop the sargassum from coming to the beach. And then they would have these retrofitted boats or sargassum harvesters, you know, um, collecting the sargassum before it, lands to the beach. Of course, there was a lot of innovation in terms of developing these barriers. Our colleagues, from the French islands, for instance, have provided a comprehensive manual on the pros and cons of different collection operations, and what you can see pictured here is the boom being used in association with the at-sea harvester. And this is one of the more efficient methods. There was a bit of discussion among scientists and ecologists, and they expressed concern in terms of, at sea, there would be some organisms. Earlier we saw some turtle hatchlings, for instance, in the mats. And persons were concerned that if it's harvested at sea, some of these important organisms might, be killed, for example, while the sargassum is being harvested. But there are some studies being done by UWI-Surmis, where it was up to last July, where some students are looking at the biodiversity within sargassum mats from close to shore and offshore, and they actually found that within 50 meters, it might be an okay place to harvest because not many organisms were found in it. So there were some concerns about that. And you would see, for instance, some innovators like Talasso Ocean with their aquadrone, their at-sea harvester. They are building in a way to be able to allow what we refer to as bycatch to be excluded while the harvester is operating. So, when it comes to sea, that's when it becomes an issue. In Barbados, our sargassum, of course, when it beaches, you have the additional issue of, sand. So, in the beginning, we were using heavy machinery to clean, and then, after several discussions and recommendations, for instance, the Gulf and Caribbean Fisheries Institute, they would have released some guidance in terms of not using heavy machinery, but more manual type of cleaning operations. Are recommended, especially as it relates to making sure that sand isn't removed. Of course, we know that manual removal is quite labor intensive, for instance, but in terms of making sure that the impact to the beach is not significant, it is recommended as much as possible. So that's where I think it's good to make sure that you harvest it before it lands, because when it does beach, it starts to break down, it releases the gases, it starts to cause all other types of impacts. And Crane Beach, for example, has invested in the booms, and they're figuring out ways, because we know the waves at Crane Beach are quite high energy. So in terms of making sure the anchors and so on are strong enough, I know the team there at Crane has been experimenting with that, for example. Because places like Dominican Republic and Mexico with very calm, shallow bays, they could use those types of booms that are already on the market I think in our context, we might have to do some retrofitting so that it serves our purpose.
Is it harmful to people who are swimming? I mean, they probably won't swim directly in it, but let's just say it's over here to your left and you want to swim and there's a little clearing there, swimming in it, surfing, any problems?
Ideally, as you were saying, you don't want to get caught in it. So some spearfishers, have reported that sometimes the air-filled sacks might get into their ears, once it starts to break down at sea. So that's quite, tricky because you have to go to the doctor to get that those air-filled sacks out. Back in 2018, I don't know if you remembered, it was in the paper, Carla and others at Barbados Sea Turtle Project. One of the mats, restricted the turtles from being able to come up to breathe. So there were over 30 turtles that died that year in Long Bay. I remember because the picture is so vivid in memory. But yes, you don't want to be really caught on your thick sargassum mat and not being able to come up and breathe, for instance. Surfing, it would have, create an issue because, the surfboard would get lodged in the sargassum, for example. This is the same thing that happens with fishing gear. Fishing gear gets fouled out to sea. I've seen pictures of persons crossing the Atlantic, in a sailboat, stuck in sargassum mats. Fisher folk here have reported, waking up in the middle of the night and being surrounded by sargassum.
I meant to ask you that question. Is this like, okay, tomorrow Lookout Barbadians, Long Beach would be full of sargassum seaweed, or this is literally, I'm going to wake up possibly to this. There's no warning. For example, if you're saying, okay, I'm seeing it in St. Lucia and St. Vincent, and these are our neighbors, is there some sort of way of saying, okay, it's making its way to Barbados and we'll be here in 2 days, like, equivalent to like a storm? Nothing to go by?
Yeah, well, we are at Surmise. In 2019, we started distributing a sargassum outlook bulletin that contains a 3-month forecast and a 6-month experimental forecast. So I'm the coordinator on that, as well as co-editor, and it's available on the Surmise website. It's produced every 2 months, and you would get a summary of what the situation is at the time based on satellite imagery. We will present the 3-month forecast, but what we really also try to do is to communicate the implications to the sectors. How would it impact fisheries? How would it impact tourism? How would it impact the environment? And then we include all the latest publications in there, and we have a spotlight on sargassum innovation. So we're now in volume 2, and all of those issues are available. Once you Google Surmise Sargassum Outlook Bulletin, you should be directed to the page. And I also work with GeoBlue Planet, and we have a website called Sargassum Hub. Sargasshumhub.org is the clearinghouse on information as it relates to pelagic sargassum. So you can be directed there to see all of the types of forecasts, models, monitoring, information about research and management. For instance, our work that we did in developing a sargassum adaptive management strategy for Barbados, for example, and other Eastern Caribbean countries. All of that is, archived on that website.
I'm thinking, as you're speaking, of some sort of sargassum seaweed app, and something that, because I'm not sure if you have signs on the beach, for example, and you work together with the National Conservation Committee, NCC, in this regard, because it's, you're doing such excellent work. Because you surprised me with 2 things I did not know. Number 1, about these things getting to your ears and what they can cause, and 2, the smell after it's been on the beach and how it impacts your respiratory system. A lot of people, I can tell you, did not know this, because we have discussions with people who I know, a lot of people who go to the beach regular, and they don't see it as a problem, but it can be. So the alerts that you're speaking of that you're working on, you said you can go to
Yes.
a particular site, but perhaps it would be an easier way that we could see it on our phones pop up.
Yes, I think an app, and actually in writing out a concept note for, sustaining the bulletin, we actually had proposed an app. My colleagues in Antigua, for example, a young, bright group of developers, they developed the NADIS app for Antigua. Our information in the bulletin is still very well. That's the thing with forecast. We can't be very specific. We can't say that this beach will have X amount of sargassum. We can tell you that these, we refer to North, Middle, and South islands in the Eastern Caribbean, and we can tell you, well, it's likely to be mild or severe, but we can't, pinpoint an area and tell you exactly you will have X amount of sargassum. We're not there yet. It's quite difficult to get there. A lot of science and consultations, for example, that will need to be done to get to that place. But we have a knowledge of the sites that are significantly affected in the last 10 years. So if you get that alert that there will be, severe influxes, you already could think, Concept Bay, Skeets Bay, River Bay, for example, Walker's Beach, you know for sure that they will be inundated with sargassum. On the south, Silver Sands, for instance, Long Bay, Crane, these are other sites that we know are significantly affected. So right now, it's really how you use and interpret the information that is being produced in the bulletin. But we want to get a place where Antigua is in terms of using that information and sending an alert based on your location. So that's the NADIS app. So for those that might be interested in checking that out, it's NADIS, that app. So I hope that one day we can get to that place where we can develop something, because it's really a hazard, for want of a better word. The impacts even last year in Puerto Rico, they actually reported that sargassum resulted in a blackout. The sargassum got into the intake pipes at one of the power stations in Puerto Rico and resulted in a blackout.
Wow.
So, very emerging impacts in different sectors, tourism and fisheries always being the most impacted, and the maritime sector, but now energy and, of course, health, another significantly impacted sector.
And all part of the climate crisis, as the Prime Minister calls it. We're going to take a
Yes.
quick break. When we come back, we want to hear what can we do now after we clean up? Where does the sargassum go, and what do we do with it? After the break. Welcome back to Face It and Fix It. We're speaking with Dr. Shelly-Ann Cox, and we're talking about the sargassum seaweed that is a menace. It's bothering everybody, but we're going to get some good news as to what happens after the cleanup. Is it a benefit to us after that? You're on mute. I'm not hearing you, Dr. Cox. Okay, can hear you now.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yes. I was saying it was all a part of shifting mindsets, viewing it as a hazard, but now looking at it as an opportunity. So we talked about sargassum influxes, and now we'll talk about sargassum kissed shores, where we see it as a resource. The biomass, when collected from the beach right now, those responsible, from the Maritime Division, NCC, Ministry of Transport and Works, they would take it to a location where they're working on producing a compost. But we have to be cognizant of the fact that, in terms of the heavy metal composition, we have to make sure that we're doing the processes to remove that before using it, in our gardens. So as it relates to some innovators in Barbados, for example, Joshua Fort has been making a plant biotonic using sargassum. Then we have Kerry Brovell, who's using sargassum in terms of the extracts. So she's extracting an alginate from sargassum and using the skins from cassava and sweet potato, for example, and making a bioplastic. Two very young, brilliant entrepreneurs, innovators that have been producing products. So bioplastics, plant biotonics, so like a fertilizer, for example. We have colleagues in Guadeloupe, for example, that have developed this solar processor that takes sargassum and other biomass to produce things like biochar, even producing green energy, hydrogen. Very interesting ways that it could be used. We've seen persons here experimenting with sargassum and fish offal, for instance, and making it into biogas. Dr. Legina Henry and her team from UWI, they have a very interesting website and a startup, a kickoff startup from UWI called Rum and Sargassum Inc. So they're using the wastewater from the rum distilleries, sargassum, as well as black belly sheep manure. And that mix is producing biogas, and they're producing liquid compressed natural gas. And if you go on their website, you can see that some cars can be retrofitted to be able to use this bio CNG. And after seeing the price of gas last night, I might have to be considering this in the future.
That's a separate topic all in itself. I would like somebody to pick me up when I leave this show now on a donkey cart, because none of us can afford. But let me ask you this: the gases that come off of the actual sargassum that we talked about earlier, how long is that a problem for? Like 2-3 days before it becomes dried? I mean, because it's not there forever, obviously. So there's a period of time.
It's different depending on how much sargassum, the amount of water that is around. I can't say for sure, but some for a few days. Once it keeps wet, so you would see at River Bay there's the inlet there with water. At Long Bay, when I visited there, and there's water in the back beach, for example, that's where it really decomposes and starts to smell. But usually when we get reports from residents, those reports are sent to Mr. Kevin Lord, who leads the cleanup operations, and they try to move quite quickly to address these issues. I know they were cleaning Silver Sands, for instance, maybe last week, But it is really one that requires cross-ministerial action as well as resources, because of course countries never had a budget for sargassum cleanup, as you would know. Back in 2018, I believe a tourism representative had estimated it at about $125 million in cleanup costs, from reports from the tourism sector, so quite significant. So if we can, explore these opportunities where government could recoup costs, then this would be ideal. And Barbados is doing quite well in terms of leading innovation in sargassum uses. So we have quite in St. Lucia, for example, as well too. There is Joanne Dujon, for instance, and he is also making a plant biotonic. And in Jamaica, for example, they're testing out using it as a goat feed. So quite interesting projects going on in the Caribbean. My colleagues and I, we wrote a sargassum uses guide, for example, and many examples. We even looked at activated carbon as one of the more interesting types of uses. There's a whole directory of all these sargassum entrepreneurs in there as well. And then we speak to some of the challenges and barriers that we would need to, actually address before, sargassum could really be seen as, well, the golden tide, as we refer to it sometimes.
Can we go back, if the producer can put back up that photo as we convert it to biogas? I just want you to repeat, we don't do that here at the moment.
Yes, well, Dr. Legina Henry is here in Barbados. So Rum and Sargassum Inc. is a kickoff from UEKville. So we're doing that in Barbados. So she's mixing it with the wastewater from the rum distilleries, with some black belly sheep manure. So really using what we have around us. And she's looking, of course, to upscale the small experiments that she's have.
Right, that's the question I wanted to ask, is because is it still at the experimental stage because it's not really being used on a big scale?
Yes, still experimental, and this is one of the challenges in terms of getting funding to really scale up your ideas, and looking for investors to really build that out. You would see on our website that they've envisaged a gas station that you can pull into, once your car is converted, and you can get the bio CNG from there. And others have, experimented in different size vessels in terms of biogas digesters as well. But Rum and Sargassum Inc. is, further ahead, and hopefully it could get the support that it needs to really, I would love to drive into Rum and Sargassum Inc. gas station, for instance, in the future.
Especially the rum part.
Yes. And
that was for me. That was for me, especially the rum part.
Yeah. Yes.
But I before you go, because we have about 3 minutes left, and I promised myself, for some of those children out there that don't believe the stories that we used to see these things on the beach many years ago that we don't, I really would love to ask you, what happened to our seashells that we go on the beach and we just don't see seashells anymore? You may be too young to know this, but years ago, you go to the beach, you're collecting seashells, and I mean so many and beautiful seashells, and you carry them home, and you fussy know that if you want to make anything, we have to import them. We got to import a conch shell. We sell them on the wayside, and we telling people that they come from here when they ain't come from here. We all know that. They're imported. Talk to me a little bit, if you can. What's happening, and can we get it back from the ocean coming up?
We spoke to the climate crisis, for instance, and a lot of different things are happening in our oceans. Land-based sources of pollution. we have, climate variability and change that's really impacting it. We've seen, some persons might be over harvesting, for instance, sea eggs, for example. I did a lot of my work in terms of sea eggs, and we have not gotten a population like before. And it's really a combination of factors. And as the thing about the ocean is very complex, it's very dynamic, and you can't really pinpoint one specific cause, So, I do know some conch divers in Barbados, so some of the shells may be from here, but most of them are imported, yes. We don't have that kind of continental shelf that Bahamas or Jamaica have, for example, where they have, larger conch fisheries. But we've seen the decline of certain stocks. For instance, recent coral reef report cards show that, our reef fish were declining on some of our patch reefs, not too bad on the bank reefs, for example, but, the ocean, and the ocean provides so much of our oxygen, for example, so we must be more responsible. But sometimes I think that we think that we're a land and we're not connected to the ocean. We must be cognizant of the fact that, when we litter, everything washes in, when we use lots of pesticides, that ends up, goes through the gullies and up straight into the water as well. So we need to be more responsible. And, lots of other things happening in terms of climate hazards and climate stressors, even, how hurricanes affect the ocean. I've seen after hurricanes, for example, you've seen a coral reef damage from, the intensity of the waves, for instance. Even ocean acidification, which is an issue that is quite interesting because it will see, things like shells and conch, that, build up carbonate. When the ocean becomes, the pH of the ocean changes closer to acid, then those organisms would start to break down. So,
Wow.
that would be an interesting talk as well.
But this is where,
there's so much happening.
because we do have to wrap up, and Dr. SHELLY-ANN Cox, I must say, I don't know if you got a scholarship or if you had to pay for it, but it was money well spent, or a scholarship. You are a walking encyclopedia, and I would like to extend an invitation to you to join us every other Friday, because we have what we call Climate Change Fridays. We're dealing with the climate crisis. We give away a lot of fruit trees to encourage planting, food security, and we want to talk about the marine aspect. And perhaps the producer will be in contact with you, because we need to continue this conversation. It's too short, and there's a lot we have to do. There's a lot we have to do to fight this. I mean, we may not be able to reverse the damage, but we certainly have to find ways and means to slow it down as much as we possibly can. Otherwise, we won't have a planet. So I want to thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you take us up on that invitation every 2 weeks.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. All right,
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. That was Dr. SHELLY-ANN Cox. We're going to share with you 1 or 2 WhatsApps that came in. As we said, we were supposed to be joined by the Honorable KIRK Humphrey and the Parliamentary Secretary Corey Lane. Unfortunately, they could not join us this morning from the People's Empowerment and Elder Affairs Ministry. And if the producer said we will share 1 or 2 WhatsApps. Hi, Miss Haigh. My mother has dementia, and my sister is trying to get her to sign her property to her. Is this legal? These were some of the questions that came up, and we will share them with the minister. Of course, we are going to make sure that he does join us. They do apologize that they couldn't reach us this morning. Join us this morning. What part can the banks play in stamping out financial elder abuse? Another great question. As the ministry continues to put the legislation in place to bring to Parliament on elder abuse, these are some of the things that they can look at. This question says, my great aunt is in need of help. She has no assistance and is 80 with diabetes and hypertension. No one to bathe her. I am the only one who helps, and I can't do it alone. That person, again, there's a lot of stories out there with families who don't help. Families, you got big families and they just don't help, and one person ends up doing it. So we're gonna have to wrap up now. I want to wish you guys a safe week moving forward. I'm going to see you Friday, God willing. We are going to focus a lot on elder abuse. Don't forget, we got trees to give away every other Friday, and we're going to give away our blood pressure machines thanks to Total Care Pharmacy, who sent us a set of machines to start giving away to the public in an effort to educate you about blood pressures and the extension of Measurement Month with Dr. George Connell. A lot of things coming up on the show. Continue to stay with us. Continue to send us messages. Write to us. Even outside of the show, you can also send us your messages and we will share them with you. I'm Joyanne Haigh. This has been Face It and Fix It. Have a great day.